All right, hello everyone. This is Crew Howard, and I'm going to give you a talk on ChatGPT and AI and the end of learning as we know it. So let me just jump right in. Learning is often associated with learning information and knowing how to use it. The information side, there's two sides, information and how to use it. The information side, it's over. All information is now easily accessible. First with the internet in around the 2000s, and now with ChatGPT, it's almost all there. To be more specific, if you have a routine question, you can always get a reasonable answer from a computer. And with AI, now you can ask follow-up questions in a natural way and get an even more specific answer. You're going to get an excellent answer. You just can't, you just have to know what to ask. So hence, I'm not going to teach you about thinking skills because AI can teach you thinking skills pretty much just as well as I can at the level of information. I'm never going to beat Google or ChatGPT in the realm of information. What I'm trying to do is give you a sense, a feel for why it's important and some other things like that, as well as give you some of the limitations of how to use AI. And I'll end this talk with a discussion of 3 limitations of AI that I think you need to be very careful about. Not just for the thinking skills class, but also as you move into this strange new world where computers really are going to start doing a lot more very quickly. Anything that's routine, and even not that routine, but routine enough, computers are going to be able to do it. So to start out with, I'm going to motivate this with, actually, I erased the slides, so I'm not sure how that happened. So, there we go. I don't know how that happened. So let me just jump right in and just go to Gemini. I'm going to use Gemini, not ChatGPT, because I like Gemini better. They're about the same. I'm going to start just telling it, when I give you a prompt, please reply in both English and Thai and give longer answers, and it's going to do that. So let me just start with, what are thinking skills? Right? I have not answered that question, and neither have you asked me any of those questions. So what are thinking skills? You can go to any book or the internet or Gemini AI, and it'll give you this list of thinking skills. It's about analysis, evaluation, synthesis, creativity, critical thinking. And it gives you some of these elements, and it can give it to you both in Thai and English. So let me ask, what are some specific types of thinking skills? Because that's actually what I was more interested in. And it's going to give me even more details. Problem solving around critical thinking, creative thinking with imagination, fluency, flexibility, etc. Analytical thinking, practical thinking, reflective thinking, etc. And in one of these, not in this answer, but one of the things is that it mentions pattern recognition as a thinking skill. I think maybe in the previous answer or this answer. So if I want to ask specifically, what about pattern recognition as a thinking skill? And while it's answering, I'm just going to remind you, you can ask these questions yourself, or you can pause the video and read any of the Thai or the English. So I'm not going to dwell on something that you could pause and read. I want to give you a feel for how powerful AI is and then the limitations of it. So yeah, it's going to say pattern recognition is a crucial thinking skill. Crucial is a word in English that means essential or it's necessary. I think in Thai, jamben is a similar word. So yeah, pattern recognition, why it's important, etc. You can spend a lot of time focusing on these things. Pattern recognition, because after all, Google says it's a crucial thinking skill. It doesn't say it's the only one. It gave you a lot, but it gave you this thinking skill as a very important one. So Google/Gemini and ChatGPT, to just go back, it's going to be able to answer any question you want. So it can tell you about thinking skills. So that's the first demo. So last year, one of the things that happened that the M6 class did was each student was given a bias from a list of 20 biases. And for some people, it's like, instead of pattern recognition being about thinking skills, it's cognitive biases. So they're given one of the cognitive biases and they're asked to research it and give a 2 to 5 minute presentation on the bias. Every student did a good job. And I'm going to say every student did as good a job that any teacher would be pretty happy with what they did. And I was happy with what they did too. I noticed some students spent a lot of time on the animations and others just gave a definition and showed a YouTube video and they talked about it. Everyone, I think, could be able to answer basic questions about their thinking skill that they were assigned, the bias that they were assigned. And according to some people I've talked to, the students actually rated the activity quite high. They liked it. It was a little different. It was like an activity, so students like that. They don't like to just listen to someone tell them things. They like to do something with it. They felt proud about what they did. Some were very proud about their presentation. Some liked the bias that they were looking at. And they listened to each other's presentations, and they followed along, and they nodded their heads. I'm not doing that this year. Even though you'll probably like it, and you'll do it a little bit, and you'll put in a little effort, etc. The reason I'm not doing it is because ChatGPT and Gemini, even before last year, there were things about it. So let me just show you what ChatGPT could do. So the activity before was, to say it again, take a list from 20 biases, pick a bias, research for 2 to 5 minutes, and present it. So I can just type into Gemini, what are 20 common biases that are important to recognize for thinking skills? So there's nothing magical about this. Here's a bunch of them. Confirmation bias, which I'll give you a separate video on later. Hindsight bias, number 4. Loss aversion bias, bandwagon effect, and he gives you a one-line example. And if I gave you one of these, if I gave you something like the halo effect bias, and you were to look it up, you can just type in the ChatGPT/Gemini. And actually, I want you to show... translate, show the last answer in Thai language, because somehow it stopped doing that. So, yep, it's gonna now show that. Okay, so there you have it in Thai. And what is the halo effect bias? And give me an example. So there you have it, and I'm going to have it also show me the last answer in Thai language. So there you have it. You can read this. You can even go in Google and ask for its sources, and you can read the sources. So ChatGPT can do all these things. Now, it's still a worthwhile thing. I'm not saying students didn't get anything out of it. But what I'm trying to show you with this demonstration is if you just do the minimum of looking it up, presenting it, giving an example, you are doing probably better than 50% of the students in Thailand, the average students, right? Average students don't work very hard, and you're doing very well. You're doing better than average. But it's still not very good, I would say, because it gets you to a point where you haven't really looked at it in a deep way. You just gave an example. So the third thing, it brings up the question, what is the value of information? If information can you go to Gemini or ChatGPT or Google, old school, you can get definitions and examples very easily. It's then tempting and unfortunately common to conclude that you know the cognitive bias, you know what halo effect is. You can identify it, you can identify its components, and you give an example. You know, that's pretty good in most people's book, but it's not. I don't think it takes you very far. What can you use this information? And in a way you do know it, but can you use this information? Can you think about, is halo effect related to emotional thinking? Is halo effect related to confirmation bias? So these are questions that you might want to ask. And if all you know is the example, you haven't really thought about it in these ways. So in education theory, this is called like compare and contrast type questions, where you actually have to use the information in a way that you haven't used before to sort of analyze and synthesize the information. But now with ChatGPT, AI can actually do these types of things too. So I'm going to give Gemini some of these compare and contrast questions. So I'm going to ask it, I'm going to use a different one. What is groupthink bias? Okay, so groupthink bias is this. And I will also, I think, show the last answer in Thai language. Okay, and it's going to show the last answer in Thai language. So that's what groupthink is. But what if I want to go deeper? What if a teacher says, you don't really know groupthink unless you understand how it relates to other things? So how does it relate to emotional reasoning? Well, I can just type that here. Is groupthink related to emotional thinking? And it says, yes, groupthink is closely related to emotional thinking. Yes, teacher, it is. You know, you don't actually have to think anymore. You can just use Gemini to think. I'm being a little hyperbolic and not serious. But if all you want to do is impress the teacher or get the points or even just pass the exam, exams don't let you have notes. But if you had Gemini, then yeah, you could pass any exam just by typing things into Gemini for the most part. So is groupthink related to emotional reasoning? Yes, it is. And I'll just, for your benefit, flip to Thai. I don't know if the Thai translation is very good, but you can pause, read it yourself, and decide. Okay. But what if the teacher is like, are you sure? Or is it different? And then you can ask, is it different? Because teachers like to trick you. They like to ask you, are these two related? Well, are they also different? Then we can ask Gemini this as well. Is groupthink different from emotional reasoning? Okay. And I didn't spell different correctly, but Gemini understands. So it says, groupthink and emotional reasoning are related. They are distinct concepts. That's interesting, because just before it said groupthink is closely related to emotional thinking. So which one is it? Well, it could be both. And in fact, it is both. But it's sometimes both and sometimes not both. And this is where, if you actually understand this, you need to sort of understand groupthink is related to emotional reasoning, but it's actually a different concept. I'm not going to go into the reasons why, because you can just read. All of you are, I think, smart enough to read and digest information. If you have any questions about any of this, I'm happy to go over it in detail with you. But here I'm just telling you, demonstrating, you don't have to do any of the hard thinking. Gemini can do most of the hard thinking for you, except what I'm going to say later. So the teacher might be like, well, is it related? Is it closely related? Can you explain? Well, all you have to do then is ask Gemini, give me an example of groupthink without emotional reasoning. Okay? And it's going to give you an example, right? And then show the answer in Thai, so it's going to do that. And I'll also have it give me an example of emotional reasoning without groupthink. So these are just patterns. If two things are related, emotional reasoning and groupthink, I want to see, are they related? Are they different? When do I have one but not the other? When do I have the other but not one? And I'm just asking these questions. Now, understanding some of these patterns, that's where you get a little bit into actually having the thinking skills. But you don't actually have to have thinking. You don't actually have to think to do that. You just have a little checklist. You go through, okay, if I have two concepts, I'll ask, are they related? Are they different? When do I have one but not the other? When I have the other but not this one? It's a little formula. There's nothing special about this. Any person who's motivated to do it can do these things quite quickly. It does take some intelligence to read through what is being said and ask questions and understand the language, right? So emotional prioritization, like if I don't know what that is at all, I have to look it up. But Google's pretty good. You can even ask, why don't I do that? I don't have that in my notes, but what is emotional prioritization? And then explain it using simple language. Okay, I can even do that if I don't want any difficult words. is when our feelings guide our decisions instead of using logic or reason. It means putting emotions first, even if it might not be the best choice. For example, it even gives you an example. Imagine you really want to go to a party with your friends, and you also have a lot of homework to do. If you choose to go to the party because you're excited and want to have fun, you're prioritizing your emotions over your responsibilities. Oh, okay. So what I'm trying to show you is Gemini can actually do, before Google could give you examples and answer simple questions that someone else has answered. Now Gemini, at least with this topic of thinking skills, it can do compare and contrast. It can do everything that a teacher can ask you. I can ask you 100 different questions that are actually quite difficult and lead you towards really understanding thinking skills. But if you want to, you can just type it into Gemini and give me those answers and you're done. There's not, the value isn't. So going back to what is the value of information, it's no longer that you have the information and can give examples. And it's also no longer, just a compare and contrast questions, because Google Gemini can do that as well. You can even have this write your college entrance essays, right? You make a few small tweaks, but in this age, it's very hard the line between what is cheating and not cheating, it's very blurry. I have my opinions on it, but I don't want to sidetrack from this video any more than I already do. The point here is that compare and contrast questions, even pretty detailed questions, Gemini can give you a reasonable answer. So is this Gemini telling you like what emotional prioritization is and all these other questions that it's answered with no spelling mistakes, with perfect grammar? Is this learning? You know, if a student can give a definition, give examples, and also compare and contrast, does this mean they actually learned the thinking skill? In a way, yes. In a way, no. I think 90% of people would say yes. And in fact, I would say most of your education is give a definition, give some examples, compare and contrast, and like maybe apply it to a new problem or something with problem solving. If it's like a math or science class. But yeah, I think if you can do those things, most people would say, yeah, you understand things. And certainly this is more than enough to pass any written test. If you're able to just type in 100 questions to Gemini, print it out, or have access to your phone during a test, you will pass almost any test. But here's why I spend all my time thinking about thinking skills and trying to convince you that it's important. Buddhism and I would both say no, this is not thinking skills. Giving a definition, examples, compare and contrast, these are great things. But Buddhism and I would say no, you don't actually know something if these are the things you can do, and here's why. So I'm even going to use Gemini, because it's not, you can't use Gemini to get you the information. But there are a few steps that are left over. So the questions I'm going to ask Gemini have a different feel to them. It's not just compare and contrast and give me other things. It actually has to do with blind spots, what I talked to you about last time. It has to do with how can you get caught up in your emotions? How can you get caught up in your stories? So what question do I want to ask? So here's a question I think that gets you a lot further. In thinking skills, what are some things that are easy to say but hard to do? Right. That's a Thai phrase, right? Put ngai, tam yak, de tam yak, right? Easy to say, hard to do thinking skills. And it gives you a list. I'm going to have it show you in Thai, which is what matters to you. Maybe. And you can pause anytime and look at these, or just go to Google Gemini and type these types of questions in yourself. And then one of these things it talks about is often like having self-awareness, right? Number 4, self-awareness. So yeah, understanding some of these difficulties and actually being able to recognize the difficulties when these difficulties happen. Gemini can't tell you, hey, It can't have a little bell that says, hey, right now you don't have self-awareness, have more self-awareness. So that's why you actually have to develop self-awareness in order to have self-awareness. Or let's take this phrase, active listening, right? You might think you're active listening, but if you don't realize, it's easy to think you're active listening and say you're active listening, but not actually be active listening. How can you fool yourself? If you don't actually go that far, all you can do is say the right answer, meaning you can type it out or say it verbally, but you can actually do it. When the situation arises, you can't do it. And you also don't have a feel for when it actually is difficult. Using Gemini, you can actually do this because hundreds or thousands of people have actually written about why these things are difficult. And you can learn from their experience of why it's difficult. But it's very easy for people to be like, oh, active listening is these 3 things. I do these 3 things. Automatically, I get active listening. That's actually not how a lot of these things work. A lot of thinking skills is you might do ABC, but you don't actually get the thing that you want. Emotional intelligence doesn't just mean, oh, I took a 1-week course on emotional intelligence, or I read a book on emotional intelligence, therefore I have it. A lot of these things require actually taking the time to develop and experience it, to mess up, to make mistakes, and notice it. So noticing in these things, these are the thinking skills that I think are very hard to develop. Self-awareness, just even to delve in deeper, Gemini can help you with this. So a lot of students in class have talked about fear or fear of uncertainty. So I can ask Gemini, what is self-awareness of fear, especially around uncertainty of the future, right? And I didn't spell something right. Let me fix that, okay. So there you go. This is self-awareness of fear and uncertainty of the future. And there you have the answer in Thai. And if you look through it, it gives you a lot of things to do. It even gives you some of these ways to identify it. Understanding self-awareness of fear, benefits of self-awareness of fear, how to cultivate it, how to do it, practice mindfulness, do journaling, etc. So these are things you can look up. And if you take the time to do these things, you get something special. It's not you get the information. This is something good to do. This is how I do it. I did it. Good job for me. When you do it and you actually notice, hey, what does journaling do? How did that change my thinking? How did that change how I react to fear? That's what we want you to realize. We're not going to have you develop that in this class. I mean, if you want to, I can teach you to do that. But I can't even get you to do some basic things, so there's no way I'm going to get any of you to develop self-awareness of fear. But if you want to, if you come to me and say, Kruhao, I really want to learn this. This is very important to me. Yeah, I'm happy to teach you everything I know and how to move forward in these types of things. But you have to want it. And once you want it, you actually have to develop it and put in the effort to develop it. And finally, you might think, oh, these are the things, I just have to do these things. But I'm also just going to ask an important meta question or question about how we understand things. Is it easy to trick ourselves or fool ourselves into believing we have self-awareness of fears? Right? Okay. And I think this gets you closer to what I'm trying to tell you. Gemini and AI will just tell you, yeah, it's important. These are things. You got to learn a lot of things. But yeah, learn these things. It never tells you what is enough. It never tells you, like, have you actually developed it? It can give you ways to check if you've developed it. And some of them can be very good. But the question of how you check is actually quite difficult in some ways. But I don't want to get into that because that takes a lot of time. So let me just get in. Is it easy to trick ourselves into believing we have self-awareness of fears? And yes, it's quite easy to trick ourselves into believing we have self-awareness of our fears. We can have things like surface level awareness. We can have things like rationalization, or we might just have distraction. To read that one a little more, we can just distract ourselves from our fears rather than actually, and they temporarily mask our fears. It doesn't prevent us from confronting and understanding what's going. Or we can just deny it. We can, every time it happens, we can be like, no, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid about the future. And I can't actually know, because some people actually aren't afraid about the future. And some people are incredibly afraid and in very high denial. So to actually have these skills, you have to grapple with some of these things. I don't know which way to point, but these things in the screen. But there's no way I can teach you this in class. I can sort of hint at that. I can hint that it's important, but you actually have to want to do these things in large part. To the extent, there are thinking skills where you just have to practice. You don't have to do very much, like pattern recognition. Yeah, you just practice it. You can get a book of how do I develop pattern recognition and do all the things, do all the worksheets and learn the tricks, and then do even more problems, and you'll learn it. You will develop. It's great that you develop that skill, but that's not the hard skill to develop, I think. Some of these things about how can we trick ourselves, or how do we create stories that make our lives more difficult, right? And moving on, some of what, it's not just, let me just ask the question. Is it ever not useful to develop self-awareness of fear? What are some disadvantages? Right? What are some disadvantages? And it shows you, yeah. Even though everyone will tell you self-awareness of fear is very important, self-awareness of fear is very important, you also need to be careful about this. And I don't think the earlier questions told you have to be careful, right? It can be some drawbacks, especially if it's excessive or unhealthy. How can you tell it's unhealthy? You're overthinking too much, and it's paralyzing you, which you can feel physically as chemicals firing in your brain and your body. You can develop avoidance behaviors where you're very self-aware, but you're just over self-aware. You're like, fear is everywhere, so I'm just going to avoid those situations, which is not quite the same. And there are other ones listed here. I don't want to get into the content so much, but the ability to ask these questions, to go from just, what did we do? You can scroll through the video to look through the sequence, but we just asked them, what are thinking skills? And then give us some examples. And then we said, hey, maybe that's not enough. Let's do some compare and contrast questions. But the last level is actually more the thinking about, is it difficult to develop these things? Are there downsides? How do I recognize those downsides? And Gemini will give you a reasonable answer to these things. Everything that's written there is correct. But at some level, there are things that you have to do by looking at your own body and experience and seeing what's happening in those situations. Right? The more specific, I cannot, I guess I could even try. No, I'm not going to try, but I'll type it out so you see. How do I deal with uncertainty with the future, specifically for Howard Chong in Thailand, who has issues with his immigration visa and works at 2 schools, and isn't sure he is effective as a teacher, right? I'm not going to hit enter. If you want to, you can go to Gemini and hit these things, type it in, see if it gives you a reasonable answer. But I already know for myself, nothing Gemini can tell me is going to actually tell me more than what I've developed through my own thinking skills, because I've developed the skills of looking carefully at what's happening inside me to know when I'm struggling, how I'm struggling, what my specific patterns are. Gemini will just give you, here are what the patterns of 500 people who wrote stuff on the internet said. But it can't tell you what's actually happening for you, right? It's like going to the doctor and saying, I want some medicine. And they say, oh, I have a lot of medicine. Here, take your pick. You tell the doctor, actually, you need to tell me which medicine I need. It's like, oh, well, I don't know who you are. I need to do an examination. That level of examination, of looking at what's happening and saying, does this apply to me? That is the skill. That's the real skill of a doctor. Right? If it's not just run a few tests and look at the symptoms, right? Because if that were it, and to some extent, some of medicine is like that, all we have to do is have people run tests and then check those symptoms against a database and say, okay, well, these symptoms lead to this condition, leads to this treatment. Okay, just follow the numbers. Gemini knows all that. But that's not the specific case of, where are there some judgment calls? Where is it tricky? Thinking skills is entirely about where it's tricky, right? If it's obvious, I almost don't want to call it thinking skills. It's just like a thinking pattern that's obvious. That's what I call. Or maybe I'll call this thinking skills that are not obvious. So you want to spend your time, if this makes any sense to you, you should develop thinking skills so you actually can solve the really hard problems. So my goal, or our goal in this class, this is probably unlike any class you've taken, which is mostly about memorization or specific skill development. I give you ABC, then you do DEF, right? In those classes, there's a clear model of correct behavior or right answers. If you copy the behavior or find the right answer, you succeed. But in this class, it's really about asking you to think about thinking differently. How are you thinking? What are other ways of thinking? What are the benefits of other ways of thinking? Or what are the benefits of the way you're currently thinking? So if you can find just one thing where you can say, hey, now I can see that a choice or pattern of thinking. I can see this choice or pattern of thinking. Before, I couldn't see it. This is important to me because and your reason, your specific reason, what matters to you, then this class is a success. Because this class, even just showing you that one thing, gives you that ability to look at something in a different way and gives you that pattern of, hey, I need to look at it in a different way, that I can't just Google it or look at a book or ask a friend. Right? Friends are great and they might give you good advice, but you are the one who really knows what's going inside these like 1 square foot of your brain, 1 cubic foot. Everything goes through your brain. So shouldn't you spend some time seeing how your brain is limited, how your brain has certain patterns that aren't helping? And with that one thing, you can then explore any topic of thinking skills you want. You can think about critical thinking, emotional biases, pattern recognition, any of these things. You can use books, if you're an old person like me, or AI, if you're a young modern adult. Yeah, once you know the right questions to ask Gemini can actually take you very, very far. Actually, probably the top 1%, right? That final 1%, Gemini's not going to be able to help you with. That's going to be things that haven't been done yet. And one of the things that's never been, no one has mapped your brain. No one has mapped my brain. No one has mapped your brain. So if you can map your brain and figure out what's going on in there, right? Specifically, if you can think of that one thing where you could see something different and it's important to you, that's gonna allow you to become the expert at this little bit of real estate that matters so much to your life. And if you do go to books or AI, you got to be careful. You can't just ask the obvious questions. You got to ask good questions, like, how can I fool myself? How can I trick myself? What are ways that some people think they know something, but they don't actually know? Noticing in obvious situations is easy, right? If I don't have self-awareness of fear because I'm sweating and I'm really afraid, but I say, I'm not scared, I'm not nervous, yeah, that's obvious. But what happens if you're extremely calm and you're winning and you're doing the best at things, but you're still frightened? You're still frightened even though you're beating other people and doing better than other people, and other people are jealous of you, but you're still scared. That can actually happen, and being able to realize that. Some people get this story like, if I'm successful, I shouldn't be afraid. That's not true. There are plenty of people who are successful and afraid. And being able to start seeing those stories and ways that we don't have awareness of ourselves, that's what matters here. The hard and very useful part is when you can't see something, you can see something that's not obvious and not so easy to see. Seeing those things that are hard to see is what this class is about. So what a thinking class should do, it should not instruct you on what a thinking skill is, right? With AI, That information in the age of AI is easily searchable to anyone who wants to learn it. It's more about generating the motivation about thinking skills, giving you that one example where you say, hey, I think this might be important. And right now you are applying to college. That's the number one thing. I would do probably the same thing. This is the terrible time to be teaching you thinking skills. I didn't choose the time. But if you can remember and say, hey, maybe later, maybe after I get into college, I'm going to look at some of these things a little more closely. That can help you a lot. It is about rousing interest in you to see how these skills are important today or can be important in the future. Thinking skills are especially important for blind spots you might have about your own thinking patterns. It should not be another thing to learn, i.e. memorize, and then be able to repeat back on an exam. You have to be able to use it. That's what matters in this class and for thinking skills. So this first part about learning was the same slide before. Learning is often information and how to use it. Now information is totally available through AI, but how to use it has limitations. ChatGPT doesn't tell you how to use the information. Knowing the information is only is a 0% differentiator. It doesn't matter. Everyone has that now. Knowing how to use it is what matters the most. ChatGPT doesn't tell you what good questions to ask for your situation is. This especially applies to blind spots. So if you ask simple, obvious questions, it'll give you probably simple, obvious answers. You need to actually ask, what are some of the non-obvious things? And sometimes ChatGPT might not actually be very good about it because there are things that everyone thinks is true, and ChatGPT will just probably tell you it's true as well. But if you actually know and look, you can actually see things that other people don't see. And ChatGPT can offer incorrect or conflicting information. I think it's getting to the point that Gemini is quite good at not giving you bad information, especially about routine things. So sorting and weighing the information to make decisions is something that requires human judgment, especially for things like making decisions in your own life. So it's never going to tell you this is the only right thing to do, because that's obviously wrong. Different people are going to need different things. But it'll say, hey, if these things apply, then this might be. If these things apply, then this might be. But then it might say, but there's a lot of variation, so you got to look at your own situation, right? It's wonderful. If ChatGPT could tell you what to do 100% of the time, that's great. That's what I have written down here in the very small type. It might be okay to blindly follow ChatGPT 90% of the time. It's probably going to be 90% of the time correct. But knowing that 10% of the time where what it tells you the first time is not correct is sometimes very, 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 very important. And you got to watch out for that.